Hello there, everyone. I've recently finished reading Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, and it has the honor of being the first book that I'm going to be reviewing on my channel. So that's great. Anyway, when I was sort of doing the research for this book review, the first thing I looked at is other people who have reviewed this book online. And I came across mostly positive comments, but the ones that were the most liked were the negative ones. And the critique, if I had to give a common theme, would be he's exaggerating. And I'll put sort of photos of this on screen so you can read these comments for yourself. But they basically say, the Irish saved civilization. No, the Irish didn't save civilization. That's insane. Maybe they preserved a few manuscripts, and even then, there were other civilizations at that time, like China and, the Byzantines. So that means the Irish obviously didn't save civilization. So that's what most of the comments revolve around. And here's what I'd like to say, right? The author's title is not the same as the author's claim in the book. And that's just necessary, okay? Because we like to think, okay, the title should best reflect the author's claim as possible. But the thing is you can't have your title be like extremely detailed and complicated and full of caveats like the claim can be. That's really not what you're going to do. Instead, you're going to come up with maybe a snappy title, and you're probably going to do that after you come up with your claim and probably after you've written most of your book. I think for a lot of authors, the title is kind of an afterthought at the end of their writing process. So, I mean, again, literally judging a book by its cover isn't going to help you. And Cahill knows that it's exaggerated. I doubt he doesn't know that, right? But he kind of expects his readers to then go in and then actually read the book, right? Actually read the book. Yeah, maybe they get misled by the title, right? But then they read the book and then they find out what he's actually trying to say. But for some reason, people can't actually read the book anymore. Read the book before they write their stupid critique. And then, yeah. So let's see what happens when we actually read the book, okay? Here it is. The Greek Bible, the Greek commentators, and much of the literature of ancient Greece were well enough preserved at Byzantium. Okay, so immediately, anyone who says, oh, he doesn't talk about Byzantium, what are you talking about? It's right here. He's acknowledging that, right? But then, of course, he goes on to say maybe the Latin literature wouldn't be as well as preserved, right? And then on Islam, on Islamic civilization, he writes that had the manuscripts not been preserved, Islam, quote, would have encountered scant resistance to its plans, just scattered tribes of animists ready for a new identity. Whether this state of affairs would have been better or worse, I leave for the reader to ponder. So he's saying that there would still be civilization in the area. They would adopt sort of ideas from Islamic thinkers and Islamic writers. It just wouldn't be the same civilization, okay? So that's what he's saying, okay? And the title doesn't match his claim. And that's fine, okay? I think it would be a very big stretch to say that all civilization on Earth would have been God had a few Irish scribes not preserved the manuscripts, okay? But saved civilization within this context is clearly hyperbolic for saving certain aspects of Roman civilization. And he's also saying that Irish monks led to the Carolingian Renaissance. They contributed to that movement, and that this contributed towards what we now call Western civilization. So Western civilization, as we know it today, what we call Western civilization today, would not exist without the work of these Irish monks, at least not in the same way now. So saving civilization is just hyperbolic for preserving aspects of Roman civilization. And of course, he doesn't talk about China the whole time, or Islamic civilization, or the Byzantine Empire, because it's his book. It's his book that he is writing. We are so quick to judge authors if they don't include something that we want in their book. If they don't include something that we think is relevant, and if they don't explain what we want to be explained in explicit detail. They don't realize that authors are working with a limited amount of time to research, limited number of pages. Even if they do include what we wanted, then another person's going to come along and say, this is not in your field. This is not your area of expertise, so it's just not worth it to include in your book. You're talking out of your lane. So no matter what, the author's going to have someone complaining about it. If he says too much, then people are saying, why is this a relevant topic in your book? Why is this topic in your book when you clearly haven't researched it enough? And if the author decides to keep his book a little bit shorter and not include everything, people are going to come along and say, hey, why didn't you include China in your book about Ireland? Why didn't you include China in your book about Ireland? Well, okay, I'm sorry. This is not your book, okay? And if you want to write a book about medieval China, and if you want to write a book about Islam in the Middle Ages, and if you want to write a book about the Byzantine Empire, I mean, go ahead. The world's your oyster, okay? Write that book. That's not this book. This is a book about Ireland, okay? And let's just keep that very clear, okay? So what do I have to say about the book? Do I have an overwhelmingly positive review of it? Do I think this book was perfect? No, of course not. In fact, I'd say I disagree with elements of this book more than a lot of the commenters. I think they're just complaining about the wrong things. So here's the thing, right? In his book, Cahill sort of draws this distinction between the Christianity in Ireland and the Christianity in continental Europe. He draws this distinction between the monks of Ireland and the monks of continental Europe. And I'm going to say this. Cahill's fault lies not in his underappreciation of Byzantium or China or Islam. His problem is in his underappreciation of continental Europe. In fact, I would say that he becomes overzealous in his attempt to appreciate Ireland, so much so that he wants to distinguish and elevate it so much, and he does this by denigrating continental Europe at the time and every sort of thing that was going on there at the time in order to achieve this end. I understand that Ireland was different vastly from continental Europe during the early Middle Ages, and I understand that Western Europe was in a poor and fractured state after Rome's fall. But Cahill's disparagement goes way beyond that. For instance, he goes as far as denigrating Benedictine monks in his books. He thinks that they sort of replaced the Irish way of monasticism in continental Europe, and he says that this was a bad thing. He says, soon they, as in continental Europeans, would find even greater virtue in the rule of Benedict of Nursia, whose foundation at Monte Cassino would become in time the mother house of Western monasticism, a monasticism of disciplined uniformity enforced through floggings, if necessary, by an autocratic abbot. Blessed by successive popes, the rule of Saint Benedict would in the end obliterate all memory of the pluriform Irish. So he's saying here that the Irish are less strict, that they allow for more diversity in their rites, that they allow more freedom for their monks, while the Benedictines are evil and cruel, and that they have an autocratic abbot bossing around and using corporal punishment to keep the monks in line. And I almost just don't even know what to say here, because it's honestly, the mistake here is really embarrassing, right? So, Irish monks, at the time, Irish orders of monks, they use corporal punishment too. They use that too. Quite frequently, in fact. And I've, in fact, found a paper by Tomasz Graf, who is a Polish historian. And in it, he actually goes as far as to argue that Columban monks, an order of Irish monks that Cahill constantly praises and elevates throughout his book, he goes as far as saying that these Columban monks were more cruel and more inclined towards corporal punishment than the Benedictine monks, and that one of the reasons for the Columban monks' decline was that they were way too strict as opposed to the Benedictine monks. Here's what he has to say on the matter. The punishment, that is the punishment of monks, could be plain beating. Especially strict in this respect was the rule of St. Columbanus of Bobbio, which, for example, for failure to return a required item until the next day, prescribed a penalty of 6 blows. Whoever scratched the table with a knife received 10 blows. And, for speaking one's mind too cruelly, one was hit as many as 50 times. The harshness of the rule was met with stringent opposition of the monks on the continent, who preferred the moderation of the Benedictine rule. So, we actually have good evidence to say that it could have been the opposite. It could have been that the Benedictine rule was less strict and less autocratic and less relying on corporal punishment than Columbanus. But in his book, Cahill makes it seem like it's the opposite, when that's just simply not true. They were probably around the same amount strict in that regard, and maybe even the Columban monks were more strict in that regard. So it's just dishonest. And it was admittedly difficult to sort of find the primary source on this matter, the rule of St. Columbanus, but I managed to find it, and here's a quote from it in Latin. Et qui comederet sine benedictione duodecim percussionibus. That is, whoever eats without praying, there's 12 strikes that need to be the sort of punishment. Just a fair warning, I found this on Wikisource, so feel free to correct my edition of this if this is not correct, if this is not what the rule of St. Columbanus said. But to my knowledge, it seems to be accurate, and especially considering that it's verified by another source, because it seems to corroborate with what Thomas Graf has to say about it. So anyway, that's that. So as we can see, the author of this book clearly has a very pro-Irish bias and a very anti-continental Europe bias, and that leads to sort of many historical inaccuracies. And honestly, I think this undue hatred for continental Europe in the early Middle Ages is why the book sort of doesn't reach its full potential. Because towards the end of the book, he's talking about all of these different Irish monks who were involved in the court of Charlemagne, who were involved in the Carolingian Renaissance, who contributed to the cultural flourishing that happened at that time. And he's just sort of listing all of these names of all these different monks. And it's sort of towards the end of the book, and it's sort of all stuffed into like a few pages. And I'm wondering, why didn't he base much more of the book on this part? And I think the reason why is because it would force him to admit that these Irish monks were doing it through Carolingian institutions. That is, they were doing it through a medieval kingdom, that they were doing it through the institutions of continental Europe during the Middle Ages. And he hates those institutions, so he can't bring himself to talk about it for that much time, and that really does injustice to his book, and it really actually ends up undermining his point at the end of the day. Now, I think there's a very specific historical narrative that Cahill adopts in order to justify this extreme separation between Ireland and continental Europe. And it's through his conception of St. Patrick. And I'm going to get really nitty-gritty here now into the historical details, so bear with me. But essentially, his narrative of St. Patrick is that Ireland was essentially pagan completely before St. Patrick came in. St. Patrick was sort of rogue, and he just sort of went into Ireland on a spur of his emotion. And because of that, Irish Christianity developed in a fundamentally different path than the Christianity of continental Europe. And it was because of that it was less harsh, which as we've seen isn't true, and that it relied more on monasteries and that it had more women leaders. That's what he's sort of saying. So he's saying, because St. Patrick sort of went there alone, and because Ireland was entirely pagan before he showed up, the Christianity there was way different than the established Christianity on the European continent. And this is just probably not true. Admittedly, there's a lot of different theories in Patrick scholarship, and there's a lot of different ideas about what later sources after his Confessio are sort of to be relied upon, because he only has two writings. He has a letter to a British king saying that he shouldn't have taken slaves during a raid in Ireland. He shouldn't have taken Christian slaves. And there's another writing, his Confessio, where he talks about his sort of life story. But he doesn't mention a lot of things in there, and it's sort of a brief document. But after that, we have a lot of biographies of St. Patrick. We have Muerchus. And these biographies, of course, are never going to be as accurate as the primary sources from St. Patrick himself, right? So why am I using them to develop a view of Patrick if they're not 100% accurate? Well, I think they're needed in order to develop a complete view of St. Patrick's labors. Because in his own confession, he says, quote, "It would be too long for me to tell the whole story of all my labors, or even just to tell some parts of it." Clearly, then, there are elements of St. Patrick's life, many, in fact, probably the bulk of St. Patrick's life, that are just not included in his original confession. So it would really be a bad idea to just ignore everything besides his own writings, when we clearly know that these writings are an incomplete view of his life and work. Now, I understand the concern about inaccuracy of later biographies, but it's important to remember that we're not just talking about St. Patrick himself and what he actually did, but also how the later Irish Church viewed his role. And that might be more important for my purposes, because Cahill is specifically talking about how the Irish Church developed in its own direction away from the West because of St. Patrick. So if later Irish views on the matter placed St. Patrick not as a foil to continental European Christianity, but almost as a supporter of it, then that would be good evidence to suggest that the Irish Church that Cahill's talking about didn't view themselves as entirely separate from the continental European Christians, and that they did not view themselves as all that different. Also, it is possible, certainly not easy at all, to determine which stories we find in the later biographies might have a degree of accuracy to them, and which ones were entirely fabricated after the death of St. Patrick due to exaggerations of his piety, etc. So let's get into it one by one, each of the stories that we are acquainted with in his later sources. I'm mostly going to be going along with the opinion of J.B. Bury, the author from the 20th century, who wrote a book on St. Patrick where he did rely on many accounts from later biographies. I'm largely of similar opinions to this author, and I will be using his work to sort of guide us along here. Anyway, we begin by noting that Christianity in Ireland may not have began with St. Patrick at all. It is known that Palladius was sent to Britain and Ireland in the 5th century, and many scholars, including J.B. Bury, in his book, Ireland's Saint, placed Palladius as having entered Ireland before Patrick. I'll get more into Palladius later, though. I just wanted to note this, that it is interesting enough that he was called by Pope Celestine to minister to an already existing group of Christians in Ireland. So, if his ministry dates to before Patrick's, then it is evident that Christians existed in Ireland before Patrick. And I'll get into the accuracy of all of this later, but I just wanted to bring up that possibility. Now, even if we did date Palladius' mission to a time after Patrick initially arrived in Ireland, there's still good existing evidence for pre-existing Christians in Ireland. This is because of intermarriage between the Gaels and Britons, particularly with Gaels of higher ranking. We are told that Fedelman, apparently a son of Laocaire, was married to a British wife, and that they had a son named Fortune. Interestingly enough, this family is said to have converted immediately upon seeing Loman, a companion of St. Patrick, reading the Gospel. What is so interesting here is how different this is from other conversion stories we find in later biographies. Typically, later biographies, in order to exaggerate the saints' bravery and piety, will create foil characters like King Laocaire or the Druids, who typically engage in these huge competitions. And this is most seen in Muirchew's account of St. Patrick, but we also see this in other sources. And all of this is to say that it would be unlikely for an author to make up a story where people are very easily converted without any help of the saint. And in fact, it's even more interesting to note that St. Patrick isn't even given credit here. It's admitted that his companion, Loman, was there. So with all of this in mind, I think it would be fair to say that this could be an accurate reflection of real events that took place in 5th century Ireland, and that this is not a distorted or fabricated account, that is relatively accurate to the time period. Another interesting note is that, again, Fedelman has a British wife, and this would be very common in 5th century Ireland, but it would be less and less common as we go into later centuries of medieval history. So this detail, that of Fedelman having a British wife, it is unlikely to have been fabricated in a later century where that was just simply less common amongst Irish nobles. So this, again, is a sign of accuracy and of a preserved account from the 5th century where Irish people marrying Britons would have been more common. And this is because the 5th century is when Ireland had a lot of cultural contact with Britain. In fact, that's why these raids were happening. It's not positive contact, but it was still happening. And that's why these Irish nobles were taking British wives. But this sort of contact with Ireland and Britain and the habit of Irish nobles taking British wives, for whatever reason, would become less common as these centuries go on. When the later biographies and when these sort of fabricated or exaggerated stories came into existence. So for that reason, I think we can clearly say that the story of Fettelman, his son, and his wife, this is pretty accurate, and it might actually come from real events associated with St. Patrick in the 5th century, because it fits the 5th century cultural context. Okay, but why does it matter that this story is accurate? What does it actually mean in our sort of grand narrative? Well, it's clear that if someone converts instantly upon seeing the gospel presented to them, then it is, again, proof that they knew about Christianity, and this is, again, because Fortuyn has a British mother, and Fettelman has a British wife, and this British wife might have even been Christian at one point, and might have at least knew about Christianity. So we can already see the influence of Christianity, and that's why they accepted it so easily, because they were already familiar with it to an extent, and they were just sort of waiting for someone to introduce it to them in further detail. So that's one piece of evidence already talking about pre-existing Christians in Ireland. And again, it's proof that there's Christian communities already there. And this is the position that Bury takes, and this is the position that a lot of scholars would take. But, okay, so there were Britons in Ireland, some of whom were married to Irish nobles and officials, who may have helped ease the process of conversion to Christianity. But is this really a significant presence at all, though? Would this be enough to influence the direction of the later Irish Church? Well, not as much as some other details that we're going to be adding in. So, of course, I've already gone about establishing that there was an existing Christian presence in Ireland, although it was rather small and insignificant. But in terms of the development of the Irish Church after Patrick, we need to look at what Patrick was doing and where he came from. So in his book, Thomas Cahill likes to make St. Patrick out to be the anti-Roman almost. He is seen as the opposite of what mainstream Christianity that developed in the Roman Empire was like, and he is seen as a huge breakaway from the rest of it. He is seen as entirely separate, and he is seen as the explanation for why Irish Christianity developed so differently from that of the continent. However, if we look at St. Patrick's Confessio, he says, quote, "I would love to visit my home and family, and not only there, but also to go to Gaul, and to visit my brethren there, and to see the faces of the holy ones of God." So why does he want to go to Gaul? Well, according to J.B. Bury and a few other scholars, St. Patrick has spent a significant amount of time in Gaul. And in fact, that's probably where he got his training as a priest before he went on to his mission in Ireland. So, again, Patrick is not some isolated person. He is not someone who is completely disconnected with the rest of Christianity of his day. He has ties to people in Gaul, and he likely studied under people in Gaul, and this is likely what influenced his direction that ultimately ended up influencing the Irish Church. And he might not have gone that far in this. J.B. Bury argues that St. Patrick spent time specifically at Lierns, the monastery off the coast of France, what is now France, and he also argues that it's likely that the story about St. Patrick going to Rome at one point is true. Although these are both found in Murchew's biography of St. Patrick, they are a little bit hard to confirm, and there would definitely be a reason for people to make these stories up later. St. Patrick going to Rome would give him an extra sense of authority. It would be like, yes, his mission has official backing from the rest of Christianity, and the Pope, who's sort of, by this point, by the time Murchew was writing, seen as the leader of Christianity in the West. So there would be reason for these particular stories to be made up. But I don't think it can be doubted that St. Patrick went to Gaul and that he studied in Gaul. Where this was in Gaul and whether he went as far as Rome, that is subject to debate. But he was in Gaul. So, I mean, again, his Christianity is not separated radically from the Christianity of the continent. Also, J.B. Bury argues that St. Patrick originally intended Christianity in Ireland to be very similar to that of continental Europe, to be very similar to that of the rest of Western Christianity, and that it was only after his death that Christianity in Ireland began to have any noticeable differences. He says, quote, "After Patrick's death, his work was partly undone, and the Irish Church developed on lines that were quite different from his original design. Irish monks abandoned the recognized mode of shaving the head that he had enjoined and adopted the native tonsure of the Druids. The central authority of Armagh couldn't maintain itself against the centrifugal spirit of the land or resist its presence." So there it is. Now, even if we assume that Patrick did not intend for Irish Christianity to be this way, and that he really did intend the power of the monasteries over the power of the central see at Armagh, that still doesn't mean that leaders from the continent didn't attempt to establish any kind of communication with the Irish churches. And this is where we get back to Palladius. So Palladius is mentioned in Muirchew's Biography of St. Patrick. It's said that he went to Britain first and that he intended to minister to the Irish, but that he died in Britain and his mission was cut short. And normally we might think, okay, is this just something that he made up? But in fact, there is corroboration from another source. That source is St. Prosper of Aquitaine. And he is basically contemporary with the events that he is describing because he died in the 5th century. And the 5th century is when Palladius was sent to Ireland. He writes the following, St. Prosper of Aquitaine. "Palladius, having been ordained by Pope Celestine, was the first bishop sent to the Scots believing in Christ." Now, note this. He's the first bishop to do this. So he either predates Patrick becoming a bishop or just predates Patrick's mission at all and any intentions of him going to Ireland. Both are possible. And the Scots believing in Christ, that implies there's already a Christian community. And just a note on the word Scots, here it means Irish. The Kingdom of Scotland was not yet established at this point in the 5th century. And the name Scot here means Irish. And this is, again, confirmed in Muirchew's biography, where he just says that Palladius is being sent to Ireland, and he's going through, making his way through Britain beforehand. So either way, this is a confirmation that Palladius is being sent to the Irish. There's a pre-existing Christian community in Ireland. He's probably the first one there, or at least contemporary with Patrick. And another very interesting thing is that he's commissioned by the Pope at this time. So, I mean, again, this is a centralized authority from continental Europe trying to reach out to the Irish Christians. So it's not like they were neglected at all during the 5th century. It's not like they were isolated. That's the main point I want to say here. They were not an isolated community. They developed in tandem with other Christian groups, and although they obviously diverged in their practice due to radically different conditions, again, Ireland was not urbanized, they did not have the same bishop structure, and it just didn't really work as well there, and that's what Cahill gets right. But, I mean, again, they developed alongside continental Christianity. There's not a radical departure in theology or moral teaching. It is more so just in church structure. And again, this is seen because we know St. Patrick likely studied in Gaul to become a priest. We know that there's British Christians already in Ireland, so it's not like they're being introduced to Christianity for the first time by some rogue person. They're already having connections with other Christians. And 3, we know that the Pope already commissioned a bishop to go to Ireland to administer to the people there, so there's already an attempt at contact. These 3 things, in my opinion, should sort of change our view of what 5th century Irish Christianity was like. It was not isolated. It was not entirely disconnected. There were people reaching out, trying to connect with it, and there were already ties going on between Christianity in Ireland and Christianity in other places. And then this changes our view of Irish Christianity in general, because we realize Irish Christianity is not just its own separate thing. So then why does Cahill insist upon this separation? Why does he insist upon this radical departure? Well, I think the reason why is because of his biases. He wants a sort of Christianity that's cool, that's in vogue. He's not comfortable with medieval Christianity, or early medieval Christianity. He's not comfortable with their beliefs and practices. He perceives them as harsh, superstitious, and not in line with how his morality is. So instead of simply disagreeing with them, he invents this sort of group of Christians that just happen to be completely peaceful and completely chill, and they don't do anything wrong. They're not like those harsh Benedictine monasteries that are top down and autocratic and use corporal punishment. No, they're peaceful monasteries, and they're actually completely different than early medieval Christianity, and they're actually the good guys here. And they just so happen to have very progressive views on basically everything. And guys, it's just Irish Christianity, guys. It's just no. I'm sorry, you can't invent your own. You can't just invent your own sort of group of Christians just because you want them to be the good guys. And I think that's why. He wants the Irish Christians to be the good guys in his books, the sort of protagonists. He's a good writer in that way. He frames it as a story. And in order to do that, he makes them seem as a completely different character and as, again, the good guys. But as we've seen, they're not, even if we assume that Irish Christianity is completely different than the rest of Christianity at the time, we are still left with the problem that they are not the utopia that Cahill makes them out to be. Their monasteries did use corporal punishment more often than other monasteries, and yeah, that's basically all I have to say. He had a good book. He had a good book going there. It's just I was very nitpicky in this video, so I'm sorry. And of course, I'm using like some very random sources in this video. So I mean, again, it's not like I blame the author for maybe not looking into this, maybe not realizing that, hey, the Columban monks did use corporal punishment, just like the Benedictines, and it's not that their way was more harsh. But still, I think these are just some caveats. I'm not saying like throw out the whole book. In fact, I'd recommend you read it because it's actually, most of it's pretty smart. Most of it is very skilled. Cahill's a skilled writer. It's very compelling, the book, and you will learn things, and you will learn a lot. But you just need some caveats before you go in and read, so you don't get the wrong impression of 5th century Irish Christianity and the workings of Columban monks. Thank you. This was the first video on this channel, and I think it's going to be pretty good, yeah. My sources are going to be in the description, and I think I'll also be able to put them in a pinned comment, but if they're not in there, they're definitely going to be in the description. So you can look into all of this yourself. And for wherever I used a print book and there's an available like copy of it online that's available for free, I'll just link that, but I'll clarify that that's not the edition that I used. And yeah, have a great day.